Hello and welcome to Gegenpressing, the Bundesliga podcast. I'm Manu, he is Stefan Bienkowski. It's the international break. It's a much needed break after a crazy transfer window. I know, some people love it, some people hate it. I don't mind the international break, Stefan. That means we have some time to reset our heads after a transfer frenzy. But I understand this is a controversial topic. How's it going, buddy? How is your head reset?
Yeah, it's a controversial topic in the Gegenpressing group chat, just because, as you said, different opinions. I'm feeling quite mixed about this international break. On the one hand, you're absolutely right. It came out a good time in terms of the transfer window shutting. I could take some proper time off this weekend. Didn't have to turn the TV on for anything. My son's currently going through sleep training, which is great fun. And I was away for the last 2 weekends in a row, so, just had a bunch of stuff to get through in the house. So in that sense, I do appreciate it. But as I was saying on social media, I do think this is probably the worst international break of the season because it comes 2 or 3 weeks into the new campaigns. You just kind of finally get a taste for domestic football after being away for all summer, and then they just pull it away from you. So I am kind of clamoring for the Bundesliga to return. I actually completely forgot it was international break until I got home from Germany on Tuesday, I think, or Monday. And I was like chomping at the bit for the next Bundesliga game, because I was just excited for it. And then all of a sudden, I'm like, oh, for God's sake, I'm going to have to go find which bizarre streaming service is showing Germany and Scotland games here in the UK. And it wasn't easy. And I ultimately did do that. I missed both the Germany games, even though we're talking about it today. But thankfully,
okay.
Manu, you watched it, wrote about it.
I wouldn't say thankfully.
Fixated on it.
I wouldn't say thankfully. There was definitely some regret after the Thursday game in particular. I did have to rewatch the Sunday game after the fact because I spent the Sunday morning. There's a countryside around here called Saanich, and there's farm stands and all that sort of stuff, and it's going into fall, so we were on pumpkin hunt and that kind of stuff, right? Which is great fun with a child. I tell you that. They just absolutely love anything
Gilmore
that's
Girls
orange.
season.
Yeah, yeah. So, but I did watch the Northern Ireland game after the fact, and better. The Slovakia game, it was a horrendous step back into the dark ages of Hansi Flick and early Julian Nagelsmann period. I have a lot of thoughts on why that is. I also have a lot of thoughts on why the first half against Northern Ireland was what it was, until they really turned it on in the second half with much more creative football. But I think there's a lot of negative takeaways from this window, which stretch back to the Nations League, where we chatted about that, which was supposed to be a celebration for the return of the German national team, and really wasn't, and ended in 2 defeats. So Stefan, I think the positive about this window maybe is that in the second game they turned things around. But yeah, I kind of wish I had those 90 minutes against Slovakia back. But the great thing about it was I had Thursday and Friday off work. So, I had all of Friday off and I had all of Saturday off because there was no Bundesliga football. And then Sunday, I spent 90 minutes watching the Northern Ireland game, and it was much better.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I didn't get a chance to watch these games. I have seen the highlights, and I'm sure we could spend the whole episode discussing Antonio Rudiger's Bambi on ice impression in both games, I thought.
I thought Carr was way worse in game 1, but there's a reason he didn't play in game 2.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, yeah, you have to be bad when Robin Koch's on the pitch and I choose to criticize another defender. That shows how bad it.
I think Koch is fine. He's just not a starter for this team. But you're right. Yeah. If your coach decides to put in a backup defender to start the game, then your performance was shit. I'm not gonna mince my words here, but that was a real shot, right? Like a real warning shot by Nagelsmann.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think it is quite interesting. I was looking at the stats there, and Nagelsmann's now been in charge for 25 games.
Mm-hmm.
and he's got a points per game average of 1.8. Slightly better than Hansi Flick's 1.7. Way behind Jogi Löw's 2.09, and also way behind Jurgen Klinsmann's 2.06. Behind Rudi Völler's 1.85 when he was in charge before Klinsmann came along.
But Völler
I
reached
don't
the
know,
World Cup
Manu.
final, right? I mean,
well, yeah, exactly, yeah. But like, I do kind of, at the risk of maybe triggering you, and your, understandably patriotic views on the national team, I did look at both those lineups for those games, and I thought, there's obviously great players in there. I thought Florian Wirtz actually looked really good in both games, at least from the highlights perspective. He should have scored against Slovakia, scored an outstanding goal, free kick. Voldemad is up front, exciting player to watch. Aside from that, though, it's the same old, isn't it? It's Goretzka at number 10, it's Serge Gnabry, it's Rudiger. I thought Baumann looked like a very average goalkeeper. I think it was the goal against Northern Ireland in particular.
but
where
he
it
kept
just
the
went
team. He was very good against Slovakia.
Was it? Okay, that goes to show the difference between the highlights, fair enough. But the goal he gave away against Northern Ireland, where it kind of, I think it was the shot at the back post, it just went right up him. I was kind of thinking, and I know this isn't really fair because he's replacing a generational world-class talent, but I kind of watched that thinking, that feels like the kind of shot Manuel Neuer saves, the one right in front of him. And I don't know, it's just, I just kind of looked at that team and I kind of thought, it just doesn't really strike me as, the weird thing is, like when Nagelsmann came in, he kind of he tried to give us impression that, everyone would get their chance, and he was calling up every Tom, Dick and Harry from the Bundesliga and saying, you'll get 15 minutes to prove yourself and things like that. And I know some players did well. Baumann, maybe a good example, actually, and guys like Abiri as well, like that, I suppose, and Burkhardt as well. But to be in a situation now, 25 games into his tenure, and we're still kind of watching Leon Goretzka still trying to play as number 10 and relying on Serge Gnabry to be a goal threat. I know Gnabry's had a decent start to the season, but and Rudiger as well, perhaps a good example, and Jonathan Tah. I don't know if this is just Nagelsmann being a little too orthodox, or if, Germany just simply don't have any alternatives, or he feels like doesn't have any alternatives, but it just doesn't strike me as a very exciting team right now.
No, it's not. I wrote about that in my commentary for Forbes. I always, I'm asked to do these national team roundups whenever they play. And Serge Gnabry and Leon Goretzka were in the Euro 24 squad. And, I think there was a lot of applause for that. Goretzka is one that I find in particular difficult because he's an excellent footballer, and he will always give me this impression that he's an excellent footballer, but the coaches just can't figure out where to use him. And we had something similar happening with Kai Havertz for a while, right? And Nagelsmann figured that part out by just playing him as a striker, which I think is a good role for him. It was a number 10. And we get to Havertz and Musiala and their absence, which I think was very noticeable in both of these games, which is why you all of a sudden have Leon Goretzka playing as a number 10. But, there was a lot to be made of the fact that Goretzka was out of the team. And all of a sudden, there was a very strong cohesion. And there was also so much made of how Julian Nagelsmann sent the best team and not the best individuals to Euro 24. And the results were accordingly very good. And the football was fun to watch, right? Because you had a team out there. He's kind of lost his way a little bit since Euro 24. Maybe it's because Toni Kroos and Ilkay Gündogan are gone. These are two powerful voices in the dressing room that maybe at the time said, Leon is a great guy, but we're probably better off him not being here. It's going to create a situation where you have to use him and we don't have a place for him to be used, And now they are gone, and Joshua Kimmich is a very large voice in the dressing room again, and Serge and Leon are his best buddies, so they're back, right? And since they're back, we are back into a situation where things aren't great. And I think there's a direct correlation between that. And this might sound unfair to some, but I think there's a direct. You just look at the results. You look at the results before the Euros, where everything was great. Then Leon comes back, and all of a sudden things are starting to fall apart again, right? Same with Serge. He wasn't at the Euros either. Different reason. I think he would have been nominated for fit, fair play. But I think there is a direct correlation here, and Nagelsmann sort of alluded to that after the Slovakia game, that maybe he has to call up different players in the future. Not the best players. And Leon Goretzka sits on the bench against Northern Ireland. He comes on in the second half and he offers something, but I think there is something to that. He has to sort of rediscover. He has to rediscover where he was at when he started with this job. After the Turkey and Austria defeats, he kind of went off the path and tried to build a team. And he's currently not finding the right chemistry. And maybe we have to go back on leaving the likes of Goretzka and Gnabry at home and, nominating different players and finding players that can fulfill roles. I also, I think it's coming sooner than later. Manuel Neuer is in tremendous form. He's not coming back. The way he was asked to retire to make room for Marc-Andre ter Stegen, who is now also injured and might not come back. I think that while Oliver Baumann was great against Slovakia, I think maybe it's time to change, bring in the new generation. There is, good goalkeepers in the Bundesliga. Finn Dahmen is one who's been nominated from Augsburg. Alto Bolo is, he was great with the U21. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's time for him to put him in the goal. Germany made that very drastic, gutsy decision ahead of the World Cup in 2010 to put in Manuel Neuer, a very young goalkeeper, in goal, and it worked out really well. So, I think he has to rediscover his boldness a little bit, Stefan. That's lacking at the moment.
Yeah, I think so. I think the interesting thing is that, you're obviously right that they've played really well at the Euros, but it was also a very old squad. As you said, Gundogan, Toni Kroos, but I just checked there when you were talking. The average age of their starting 11 against Spain was 29.8.
Yeah, very old.
And the average age against Denmark, the game before, was 29.3. At this point, Nagelsmann's younger than half the team, half the players in that squad. And the thing is, then, obviously you can say, look, he's obviously missing quite a lot of players who would probably make that team far more interesting. Like, you're obviously, talking about Pavlovic, Kai Havertz, as you said. Angelo Sterl's in the squad, but I don't think he was fully fit, if I'm not mistaken.
Musiala is obviously the big one missing.
Musiala, of course, big one. Even guys like Nico Schlotterbeck, Burkhardt, guys like that. Tom Bischoff hasn't really got going at Bayern yet. So I guess you could maybe give him the benefit of doubt over this international break and say some of the young players that he'd want to bring in aren't quite there yet. But at the same time, we're talking about maybe 3 or 4 players there, and some of them are good, some of them are still trying to find a way. Still huge question marks over Tom Bischoff. And then you kind of go further a wee bit down. And I'm looking at the most viable German players on our website right now, and a lot of them are over 25. And I do kind of wonder, as you said there about under 21s, if Nagelsmann was supposed to come in and kind of shepherd in this new era for German football, he was supposed to be the replacement, not just because Jogi Löw wanted to leave and Hansi Flick didn't work out. The whole reason Hansi Flick didn't work out is because people were like, well, this guy's just Jogi Löw 2.0 because he's been Jogi Löw's assistant for the last 400 years. So obviously he's not going to change things dramatically. So they bring Nagelsmann in, young guy, likes to skateboard around Sabina Strasse. He's a cool dude. Supposed to be bringing in fresh ideas. And as you said, he seems to be really reluctant to actually make any real drastic changes. And I do just kind of wonder if it might get to a point with this kind of crop of German players, Tom Bischoff, Pavlovic, Musiala, Wirtz, Voldemade, these guys aside, he might have to start being a bit more aggressive with making call-ups from the under 21s, things like that. Someone like a Brian Gruder, for example, okay, maybe he's not really playing week in, week out for Brighton. Give him a shot for the national team. Finn Jeltsch, really exciting player, Stuttgart, centre defender. Give him a shot. It's guys like that who I do kind of wonder if Nagelsmann's maybe missing a trick, especially in this qualification group. And I know it seems silly to say because, Slovakia gave a really good show themselves against Germany.
Yeah, but the U21 wouldn't have been any worse against Slovakia than what we saw.
Well, that's my point. That's my point.
Yeah.
I mean, with all due respect to this group, there's really no reason why Leon Goretzka needs to play against Luxembourg, or if Serge Gnabry has to play against Luxembourg. That's absolutely when you should be blooding in young players. Because, let's be honest, no one's really worried about Germany qualifying from this group. They're level in points with Northern Ireland. They're obviously going to beat Northern Ireland. They'll probably beat Slovakia in the return game, I'd imagine. And they'll pick up 6 points against Luxembourg. These are the games where you should be thinking, Nagelsmann really shouldn't be thinking, which of these 25-year-olds who I'm not convinced by can replace Goretzka? Maybe he should be thinking, which outstanding 19, 20, 21-year-old who's playing for a Mainz or a Brighton or whoever else. Even someone like Kevin Schade, for example, doing really well at Brentford, nowhere to be found. So I don't know. It's an odd one, and I just find it a wee bit underwhelming, to be honest, man. And maybe that's just because I've kind of gone a bit off international football in general these days. But there was very little about Nagelsmann's national team right now that made me want to go find their game against Northern Ireland at the weekend.
No, I mean, you're right. I mean, the squad selection, and I think that the conversation is completely different if Kai Havertz and Jamal Musiala are in there, right? And I agree. And Schiller got the game against Slovakia, and he's obviously fighting something. But, I also followed the EU national teams, and they all won their games, every single one of them. And I mean, the U21 played a fantastic Euro, right? Going toe-to-toe with England. And some of these players are now in the senior team. Paul Nebel got called up, who I think deserved, right? He's a fantastic player, and he's going to make his way. And he obviously also got called up because he could also represent Ireland, which is hilarious. But but there's young players coming up. Köln have this young player, Said El-Mala, 19-year-old winger who's now playing regularly in the Bundesliga. Would he have been any worse? And this team is, and this is where I was kind of, Wirtz was not great against Slovakia. He was great against Northern Ireland, but he played as a number 10 against Northern Ireland. Leon Goretzka was shoehorned into this team, so he played as a number 10, right? And Wirtz had to play on the wing. And I suspect Wirtz isn't 100% fit. I watched the first 2 games for Liverpool, and it wasn't great. And then, of course, last game against Liverpool, for Liverpool, he went off with an injury and, played for the national team anyways. He didn't look great against Slovakia. He looked great against Northern Ireland, so maybe that few extra days helped him to overcome whatever is bothering him, and that free kick was outstanding, right? But, I look at someone like El Malal, and he's a winger. He can play on the left. He's 19. He would probably be excited to get a call up. And, Gruda, you mentioned him already. Another one where I think, okay, this is a young player who's ready. Yelch is now playing regular for the U21. Yeah, no doubt. The other one that, I think, and would probably help either Rüdiger or Tar to play with once he's fit again, is Nico Schlotterbeck. He was in really good form before he went down with an injury, and I think that defensive lineup looks a lot better with him in it. So, there's a lot of compromises, and there's exciting players missing with injuries, but, Nagelsmann, I think, knows it too, and I think there's going to be drastic changes for the next 2 games in October against Luxembourg and Northern Ireland. I think you will see a very different national team. Hopefully one that, goes back to the post Turkey, Austria era, where he brought in some young, exciting players and experimented a little bit, because this sounds flippant, but I think the team that went in second at the U21 European Championships this summer could have probably beaten Slovakia and Northern Ireland, and it would probably been more exciting than what we've seen from this team.
I mean, I'm looking forward to having Slovakian and Northern Irish fans of the show in the comments underneath this, screaming at you, Manu, for such a comment. But yeah, I mean, but you're right. I mean, and this kind of goes back to the point. What is Nagelsmann's end goal here with the national team? Is he just here for a couple of years to try and win a trophy and then go off and coach Real Madrid or Barcelona or something? Or is he actually trying to, well, yeah, and if that's the case, then I don't know. That's maybe then a question for the German FA as to whether he was the right appointment, because, you know, I'm looking at what Thomas Tuchel's doing right now with the England national team, and he's very much like Nicolas Cage in, you know, Gone in 60 Seconds, where he's like, I'm putting together a crack team of footballers to win me a tournament, and I don't care what I blow up along the way. You know, Thomas Tuchel's very much like, I'm here to win a trophy. I could not care less how good an English national team is in 5 or 10 years. And I'm beginning to get the same vibe off Julian Nagelsmann when I see these lineups, you know, so, and in the way the teams he's playing and in the style of football he's playing. So maybe that's a bit harsh, but I'll wait for him to see if he can convince me otherwise. But, you know, we got a World Cup in less than 12 months' time, and it'll be really interesting to see what kind of team shot for Germany, because if it is your Goretzkas, your Serge Gnabry's, your Emre Can's, then, you know, I get that they did surprisingly well the Euros there, but I don't think they can I don't think it'd be a similar situation if he showed up with the same old faces either.
I think when I was thinking about that yesterday too, we're kind of in this between two golden generations stage, and maybe the young players that come up will be that next. But, you know, and this sounds harsh. I think Joshua Kimmich gets a lot of criticism that's undeserved. But, you know, this reminds me sort of the Michael Ballack era, where poor Michael Ballack had to keep together this national team, and the football was terrible for the most part. And, you know, they got close a couple times to win a trophy, but really the team wasn't good enough. And there was this young up-and-coming generation. And, you know, by the time they were all ready, Germany was ready to win a tournament. That also meant that poor Michael Ballack had to be shown the door. Because, you know, it just didn't fit the football anymore that these young players were coming up. And I think maybe we're coming to a similar situation here, where, you know, poor Kimmich and Goretzka maybe have to be shoved out for this next generation to come in and be really good. I mean, like, even Rüdiger, and I like Rüdiger, and he gets a lot of criticism, but, you know, he's 80% brilliant and 20%, oh my God, what is he going to do now? And, you know, Tah is Jonathan Tah. He had his peak about a year ago, and oh my God, he's slow. This is good news for the Bundesliga, because I think he's going to make the league competitive. But, you know, he's just not it. And you have young defenders like Schlotterbeck, etc., coming up that I think are going to be very good. You know, they can be, like, Mats Hummels was given his goodbyes ahead of this game. And I was thinking, like, there is no Mats Hummels in this team, like a brilliant world-class center back. I think Schlotterbeck can be that, but, you know, there isn't one in this team right now. Manuel Neuer, larger-than-life goalkeeper, maybe the best that Germany ever had. Gone, right? Toni Kroos, he is one of those few people that really did step down from the game at his very peak. He was absolutely brilliant, irreplaceable. Not going to happen. You know, you're not going to replace Toni Kroos. He might be the best central midfielder that ever played for this team. Ilkay Gündogan, a lot of people criticized him. Brilliant player, gone, right? So these are big personalities, and this current team has Joshua Kimmich, who likes to be little Napoleon, but is just not taken serious by half the team, except for his buddies, which was why his buddies are in the team, but shouldn't be. And that is a really difficult situation at the moment. I think, you know, it might be time to Michael Ballack the whole lot and send him to the pastures.
Yeah. I was chatting to someone about Kimmich, I was in Germany last week. We were discussing him, and, you know, I was saying, you know, he's obviously a very good player, don't get me wrong, but I think the issue is he's just not Philip Lahm, you know, and that's okay. You can still be one of the best players in the world and not be Philip Lahm, but for the German national team, for Bayern, like, that's probably the worst thing he could have done. The worst thing he could have probably done in his career is go to Bayern Munich. If he became like a central midfielder for, you know, Juventus or Manchester City or, you know, Arsenal,
he'd be a 150 million euro player for Barcelona.
Well, yeah, exactly. I think he'd have a very different kind of reputation. And, you know, I guess Toni Kroos kind of realized that maybe himself to an extent, like, when the sense he's like, he chose to get out of that kind of bubble in the Bundesliga and kind of go forward his own path. And yeah, I don't know. Kimmich's Kimmich's an interesting one. He's one I go back and forth on a lot. He's a player I wrote a little bit over the last season for the newsletter, and I think ultimately he's a player who's just 8 out of 10 at everything across the board, but there's not any one thing he's truly world class at. He's not a world class playmaker. He's not a world class ball winning midfielder. He's not world class fullback. He's not world class box to box player. He's just very, very good at all those things. But you can't really ever build a team around him because he's never going to be Toni Kroos. He's never going to be Philip Lahm. He's never going to be Kevin De Bruyne. He's never going to be any individual one of those people. He's a supporting act player. And, I think making him captain kind of makes him the de facto centre of that squad. And I'm not sure it's what suits him best, but yeah, I don't think he's the biggest problem in this team by any means, but it's indicative of the situation right now.
I think, again, the moment he was no longer center stage, when Toni Kroos came back, when Toni Kroos kind of took command of this team, and I know he wasn't captain, Gundogan was, but that also helped because those two players just have had a different aura about them, didn't they? And it kind of made Kimmich have to take a back seat, and I think that was good for him, because as you said, I agree with you. Like when he is pressed into being a leader, he just comes across as little Napoleon. And that's not a good thing. And I hate to say it because he's genuinely a good person. I deal with him in the mixed zone and the press boxes all the time, and he's always genuine. He's honest to us. He takes the time. But I think I've also seen him training and the way he treats other players around him. And I've seen situations where he tried to boss other players around and they turn around and laugh because they can't take it serious, right? And that sucks, but that's the reality. So, and unfortunately right now, this team doesn't have a counterpole at the moment for him.
Yeah.
And that is, a lot of these things with national teams, the time is so short where they're together. This is not a talent issue. And I've said this many times, I sound like a broken record here. This is not a talent issue. This is a chemistry issue. And chemistry with a team like that, you don't have much time to develop it. You're thrown together for 5-6 days to play 2 games. And you're either like a group of friends that gets along right away or you're not. And right now, I think this is a clique of 3 or 4 guys and the rest that laughs about them. And I think that is a big problem. There's no counterpole to this, to Joshua Kimmich at the moment. That kind of just settles him down and says like, hey, it's great that you think that way, but let me be the boss now, okay? Like, let me handle this. And maybe when Jamal returns, who I think is growing in personality, and maybe once Florian Wirtz takes a little more command and Kai Havertz comes back, maybe there is enough of a counterpole, but you got to take out Kim's buddies out of this team. Otherwise, this is not going to work.
Yeah, I think it's a good way to wrap up, to be honest. I'm going to have to take a sledgehammer to his team at some point, just when Nagelsmann does it.
I think he will do it. He went on a big rant after the Slovakia game, and he followed it through with a bunch of changes. I wouldn't be surprised if it happens sooner rather than later. He was genuinely angry, which he should have been. It was an atrocious performance. For 3 halves, it was just really bad. So, yeah. Anyways, let's move on. We had some conclusions about the transfer window. Stefan, the Premier League spent a lot of money on the Bundesliga this transfer window. You spoke to some club executives. You have a long read out on this on Transfermarkt, which is really worth reading. Everyone should check it out. Uli Hoeneß went on Doppelpass, which is always entertaining for all of us. I saw Lothar couldn't help himself and responded today. Some thoughts before we dive into this. There's a genuine worry about this Premier League money and the amount that was spent on Bundesliga clubs by a lot of fans. I don't really carry that. I think it's made up mostly, there is the amount of money the Bundesliga earns from international television revenue and what the Premier League earns from international television revenue. Because when you take the national deals, they're actually quite close, right? It's really the international deals that set the 2 leagues apart. And the Premier League kind of closed the gap by just giving the Bundesliga a bunch of money for transfers. So like Matt and I did the math. It's actually almost the gap between the two leagues that was spent on Bundesliga players. So there's a bunch of money that comes into the league. I have no problem with the players that are gone. I don't think that they're going to genuinely make the quality of the league worse. I think my biggest worry is that the money isn't used the right way. And that's maybe also where your article comes in a little bit. And to maybe draw the bridge to the national team is my worry is that it is going to be used on a bunch of mediocre players from France rather than developing the academies. That is my biggest worry when it comes to the money coming in from the Premier League. I don't actually think players leaving is the end of the world.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you say that because, I mean, you're absolutely right. And, we happened to be in Germany, went to 3 games and spoke to quite a lot of people in terms of like playing staff, but also kind of executive staff as well, a few of the clubs. I wrote a piece last week for the newsletter on Werder Bremen and their kind of big hopes and dreams of getting back up league table, why they sacked Ole Werner, why they've gone for a different approach. My newsletter this week's actually on something similar on Hamburg and how they want to, or Hasval, and how they want to kind of really basically go in a new direction as a club than they probably ever have done, to be honest with you, to try and get up the league table and kind of catch up with some of those bigger clubs. And it's interesting when you speak to different clubs at different levels and how they have taken to this kind of money that's come into the Bundesliga. So, for example, well, actually, it's funny because you're absolutely right. I mean, to start at the top, Ole Hoeneß is like just absolutely skewered the transfer window. He said, I've got it in front of me, he goes, I was absolutely stunned by what's been going on in international football over the last 6 or 8 weeks. At some point, people will say, are they completely crazy? This can't end well. We must show strength and not take the money of the Arabs, the American hedge funds, the DFL, which is German league, must ensure that the Bundesliga never have to accept this money, which it's very much like old man shouting at cloud, because I did think, I kind of posted about this over social media because he said something like, oh, German football has to go its own way. It can't follow the Premier League. And I thought to myself, German football already does go its own way. It already has 50+1. There's no clubs in the Bundesliga that are really going out there and just spending money on ready-made players, except Bayern Munich. So I think what he was basically like, if there's any club in the Bundesliga that is spending more money than it maybe should on Premier League players, it's Bayern Munich. So I kind of did a kind of thread on social media.
But do you think that's like, that is, I think that was part of his criticism, wasn't it? I mean, he did.
Yeah, he's totally moaning about Bayern. He's absolutely complaining about Bayern Munich. Ole Hoeneß doesn't really care what Leverkusen or Stuttgart do. He's complaining about the summer that Bayern Munich have just had. And we've spoken about Bayern's transfer policy, or the lack of transfer policy, so much in the show. And I think, Hoeneß is just kind of, he's just characterizing that frustration, I think, in the sense that Bayern are between a rock and a hard place, in the sense that they're getting squeezed in the middle. I think they're getting squeezed by Premier League clubs that won't spend more, and they're getting squeezed by Bundesliga clubs below them that won't sell their players to them. Because then you go speak to, I mean, we spoke to Carsten Kreb. I actually specifically asked him a question about this because we'd spoke to Werder Bremen boss Klaus Filby before it, but he said, it's becoming a bigger and bigger challenge to compete for the German clubs, especially with the Premier League and the money at disposal. Of course, we have to talk about some regulations because it looks like the sky's the limit for salaries and transfer fees, which is maybe a bit out of reality. But in the current situation, we shouldn't complain as Dortmund. We should do our work to try and make the best of it. Similarly, Simon Rolf is, after the Werder Bremen game, quite content to talk about anything but Ten Hag, was asked this question as well. And he said, it's been an intense summer. You always have to be well prepared because the English market is something you can't foresee. You have to use the right way. And then on the other hand, okay, it's good, but on the other hand, you're losing players. You're losing good players, and you have to have a mindset that says it's no problem to build again. So you've got the Bayern CEO saying, or the Bayern, honorary chairman, whatever he is, saying, the sky's falling, everything's falling apart. This can't go on. You then have Dortmund and Leverkusen, who are probably two of the best clubs in the league at making money from the transfer market. And they're both saying, well, you know what, it's not great, but you just have to be very flexible. You have to be smart, and there's solutions to this. I then spoke to Klaus Filbury at Bayer Leverkusen, at Werder Bremen, and the quote is, European football is screwed, global football is screwed. Now, I'll give you a bit of inside football here. He did not use the word screwed. He used a swear word that starts with the letter F, which I'm not going to say in case you're listening to this on a when you're driving your kids home from school or something. And I did check.
Did he use the German F or the English F word?
The English F word, which is a synonym for loving someone. I'll put it that way. And I did check with Werder Bremen and the league. I was like, look, it'd be okay to use this quote, and they were like, yeah, Klaus says he's fine with it. He's fine with you guys saying that, but we made a decision at Transfermarkt to change it to screwed just because, we don't want to upset anyone. But he goes on to say, we need financial regulation. A salary cap is one of the instruments we need. We have a rat race right now. We have Bayern Munich right now trying to compete with Newcastle, Man City, and with PSG. It's simply not possible anymore, and they have experienced that in the transfer window. We, Werder Bremen, are trying to compete with Bayern or with Dortmund, which is not possible anymore because we can't pay for the players. We simply cannot. Bayern basically cannot pay the same money for transfers versus Newcastle or Liverpool. The whole system, at least from my point of view, is not working anymore. So I think it's an interesting kind of breakdown. You've got the guy at the very top saying things aren't working. You've got the guys in the middle who are kind of working at clubs that their entire business model is based around selling players who say, we're in a golden age of making money. And then you've got clubs below them like Werder Bremen who, to be honest, and they'll say this themselves, haven't got their act together in terms of developing and selling players, saying, yeah, the world's falling apart. So, I don't know, man, it's interesting. And just to kind of give context to all this for people who haven't really been following and don't expect everyone to, the Premier League spent 653 million euros on players this summer from the Bundesliga, which is more than La Liga spent in the entire transfer window. And it's much more than they spent in any other league, except for other Premier League players. And, if you go on my article, you can see like a kind of timeline of how much money Premier League clubs have spent on Bundesliga players over the years. And it typically varies between about 100 to 300 million euros every summer. And then this summer, it's just obviously gone through the roof. But yeah, I think it's really fascinating how the clubs kind of react to this and how the leagues react. One other thing I'll say before I pass this on to you is I posted this on social media and, with the tag, let me see if I can find it quickly because the wording's quite important here. I said, yeah, European football screwed. I used the quote and I said, Bundesliga clubs lost 653 million euros worth of talent to the Premier League this summer. And a lot of top executives in the league are now calling for change. And I thought it was really interesting, some of the response I got. A lot of English football fans basically saying, suck it up, deal with it. That's not our fault. That's the Bundesliga's fault. And I had some people kind of commenting, because I kind of responded to a few people saying, well, there's a lot of people in Germany who aren't quite sure of the long-term prospects of the Premier League. And this is something I talked about in a previous newsletter before the end of the window when I said, the Bundesliga is warningly reliant on the Premier League riches. And as you said, you and Matt talked about it and how that kind of windfall of money makes up the transfer fees. But I made a point, I think I said, I'll see if I can quickly find it. This was obviously before the end of the window. But at times, the money that the money that Bundesliga makes for the Premier League is around 40% of all the money it makes for transfer fees every summer. And, it's gone as high, it's way higher this season, way, way higher. But the point I made in the article was we're getting to a point where the percentage of the Bundesliga's overall revenue, the percentage of that total revenue, so that's gate receipts, merchandising, TV revenue, and player sales. We're getting to a point now where player sales alone make up about a fifth or a quarter of all the money that's made in German football. And of that money, like half of it's coming from the Premier League. So, it's a weird kind of symbiosis situation right now where, we hate seeing players leave German football for the Premier League, but in many ways, like the Bundesliga has gotten so reliant on that money that if the Premier League did just burst overnight and it was a bubble, and I think that's perfectly plausible because you look at the amount of money that, as you said, the Premier League, the bedrock of the Premier League's finances is based on that domestic TV deal that it has.
Mm-hmm.
And people who don't know this, anyone who's watching or listening to this in the UK will know what I'm talking about. But I know in the US you can watch Premier League games for fun, for probably $5 or $10 a month or something like that. In the UK, you're paying £50 or £60 to watch the Premier League games you want to watch. And that's not even including the Saturday afternoon games. And thousands and thousands of people have just given up because, money's getting tight, times are hard.
Mm-hmm.
And you can just pick up some dodgy Amazon Fire Stick, which will give you these games for £40 a year as opposed to £60 a month. And it's proliferating in the UK. And I do kind of wonder if that TV deal in the UK with Sky Sports does begin to creak and moan and people start to panic. And I think there are some implications that that's beginning to happen based on Sky Sports' deal with the Bundesliga in the UK, which I know you guys talked about, so I won't jump into that. But if Sky Sports are beginning to blink and the Premier League begins to panic, then, we might find ourselves in a house of cards situation. But, I'm not here to talk about the Premier League being doomed. I guess the point I'm just trying to make is that it's weird. If I was, as a German football fan, I'm not worried about the future of the Premier League. I'm just worried about the future of the Premier League and what that means for the Bundesliga because it has become so reliant on those transfer fees,
I mean, it's gotten to the stage where the Bayer AG, one of the world's largest, maybe the largest pharmaceutical company, had to do a win warning because of the money that Leverkusen got from Liverpool.
Yeah, a profit warning. Yeah,
profit warning. They had to release a profit warning because of the money they received from Liverpool. This is the world that we live in now, right? One of the largest companies in the world, period, had to do this. And I think, a lot of the things that you're saying here are true. And the Germany, the Bundesliga maintained its television deal, and managed to slightly add to it, which was a huge success for the DFL. And you think the reason why it wasn't to add more is the economic situation in Germany, which is, the tariffs, Trump tariffs, Ukraine, war in Ukraine, etc. But you think the economic situation in Germany is bad, it's much worse in most other European countries, including the United Kingdom, which, is where the Premier League is based, even though it is mostly an American entity these days. It is still based in the United Kingdom. It's still fueled by people who live in the United Kingdom. And if they don't have the money, then, the foundation of it will crack. And you can play, I guess you could go NFL and play half your games in America, but good luck. I wish you good luck with that. And you're right. How is the Bundesliga going to react to it? I think twofold, right? If the money becomes less, then maybe the talent will just stay, right? Or it will lead to some of these clubs that are very reliant on it to struggle. Gladbach is a good example. With Max Eberl, he made a lot of money for them from the Premier League, and then it just stopped. I don't lose sleep over this. The Bundesliga has survived leagues cropping up and becoming the best in the world and falling like a stone around them while staying in this really good position themselves, being always financially viable, while Serie A rose and collapsed, while La Liga rose and collapsed, and I assume it will be the same with the Premier League here. It will rise and it will collapse. And the Bundesliga will just be there and solidly make money and find different ways of making money because it's run by business people. Solid, very stable business people. And some clubs will do better, some clubs will do worse, and they will have to change the economic model. But I think it's ultimately going to be fine. It's a lot of money this summer, without a doubt. And I just hope that they're invested in a way that will make it financially viable long term. That is the one thing I'm worried about. And I alluded to this. Don't buy players to, and I have to credit the OTC podcast for this. I think it was Andy Brassel, friend of the show, who said this, that more and more clubs are now getting players through the academy because they could do well in the Premier League. That is something that worries me. because you know, if you're doing that, you're on a path to just be a farm team for Premier League. That is not the right approach here. You should be developing talent first and foremost to be successful in the league that you're playing in. It also, you know, creates this uniformity across all leagues, which I just despise. And it also creates very one-dimensional football, which is my biggest criticism towards the Premier League, that it's, you know, that hammers home a style of football that for me as a German isn't aesthetically pleasing. I just think it's too physical and it's too one-directional. So that worries me if you're one of those clubs and you're looking at just, you know, creating 6'5" center backs that you found in France, or 6'5" center forwards that you like also found in France because you can sell them on to the Premier League. That is not a sustainable business model, in my opinion, Stefan. You know, and that's, I think, where you have to be creative. You have to ensure that like you still create players for you, like that you look at first and foremost your own club rather than like who you develop for.
Yeah, no, absolutely. A wasp has just flown into my office there.
Oh
so
yeah, you're in danger.
I'm in danger. Yeah, so obviously a big Premier League fan.
It's black and white. It's Carsten Kramer.
I'm just close the blinds over so it can't fly and sting me in the neck while I'm making my final point before we wrap up the show.
Yeah.
But yeah, just to kind of finish up on a positive actually on that, and I completely agree with you. I was speaking to someone from the German league about this when I was out there, and we're talking about the kind of global landscape for like media rights and things like that, and you know, they were saying it's getting harder and harder and harder for leagues everywhere to sell their media rights and to make money from selling their media rights, you know, and we've seen that from the German Bundesliga itself, and in the way that it's tried to be a lot more creative with the UK rights. But in a world where it's very hard to sell TV rights, and maybe in a world where people aren't paying for cable bundles or not paying for streaming services, there's a lot less money to spend. The league that's well positioned to kind of weather that potential storm is the Bundesliga, because, and it's not just in terms of money they earn domestically, but it's the lack of debt on the books. That's the key thing, you know, and a lot of English clubs are just riddled with debt, either normal debt or debt owned by the owners, which have bought them. And, you know, I think the conclusion that we came to, and I do fundamentally believe this, I think it's probably more likely that, because, you know, you see a lot of people being like, well, why doesn't German football just give up 50+1 and accept these new owners and let our money in or Saudi Arabia money in and American owners in and things like that and private equity and stuff like that? I think it's far more likely that in 20 years we'll have English clubs adopting 50+1 than seeing German clubs owned by Saudi Arabia or American investment banks or anything like that, because I do think it's more likely that model they have in England is more likely to kind of break down than, you know, German football just capitulates to more and more transfer fees from England and accepts, right, you know, we have to start taking this private equity money ourselves to catch up with things. I just think that's far more likely. So from a German football point of view, I think it's in far better shape to deal with things in the future.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think so too. I think this is a storm, and you have to sit it out. And that wasp is looking dangerously getting closer and closer to you. I can actually see it now on my screen. It's totally Carsten Kramer. It's black and yellow.
Yeah. Probably is Carsten Kramer.
Or whatever. What is the bee called that they have as their mascot? I forgot. It's not Heidi.
It could be a Brentford fan. They're called the Bees as well. So who knows?
Yeah,
maybe it's Kevin Schade.
It's Kevin Schade. All right. Well, on that note, let's wrap it up. We'll be back with a transfer show later this week to discuss Bayer Leverkusen new coaching appointment, which, you know, by the time this comes out, will probably be announced to be Hillman. So we'll talk about it then. And then usual, you know, newsletters will be all out. And until the next time. Auf Wiedersehen.